for being here. My name is Sofia Pineda Ochoa, as Madonna said. A little background about myself. I'm a physician. I'm originally from Guadalajara, Mexico, and that's where I lived almost all of my life until 10 years ago. I did medical school over there, and then I moved here to Galveston, actually, to UTMB to do my postgraduate training there. And that is where I work right now. Right now, my work is more just like regular medicine, but I do have a degree in plant-based nutrition as well, and I feel very passionate about it. And I have, along with my partner Bob, a nonprofit that focuses on the impact on our health and on other things like the environment of consuming animal foods. So it's something that I feel very passionate about. So thank you very much, Bandana, for inviting me to talk here. And so the talk today is about the relationship between what we eat and several diseases. But one in particular that I want to emphasize is the disease cancer, because it's one that concerns, I think, all of us, and it's an important cause of mortality and morbidity in our world. And so I think it's a relevant one to talk about. So that's what we're going to do. And so, first of all, I want to point out the fact that humanity has done great strides. We've made a lot of achievements in the sense of technology, right? We put a man on the moon. We have internet. We have our smartphones, our tablets. So much technology. But it is very interesting that we are the only species that exists that are confused about what to eat. And, you know, and this is a very genuine confusion, you know, it's a lot of misinformation as well, and a lot of apathy as well, but it's not just that, it's just that we generally are very confused about what's healthy and what we need to be eating to support our body and to give ourselves the best chance of survival and health. And so I think that's very interesting because, like I mentioned, all the other species somehow know what they should eat to best, you know, how their bodies are best suited to digest food and extract energy from it. Even the snail, look at it. It looks like its head is like so small. Like I don't see like you know, you would think that it doesn't have like a big brain or anything, but of course they're very different than us. And somehow even they know exactly what they should eat. What do snails eat? Does anybody know? Yeah, they eat plants, and there's a good reason why they do that, because leafy greens have a lot of calcium, and unlike like crabs, for example, that use like shells that are, you know, in the environment, snails make their own shell, so they need a lot of calcium to do that. So what would happen if the snails decide to eat things that it's not kind of like totally geared towards extracting energy from? What would happen? Well, I mean, they wouldn't be able to build their shell, right? And they depend on their shell to survive. And so it would have profound consequences. And what happens when we are not eating the right foods to nourish ourselves? Well, we have a higher risk of having a whole slew of diseases, right? From obesity to a higher risk of cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and a lot of things that just increase our risk of dying. And so that ideally we wouldn't use our foods to do that. We would use them to give us energy to live. All right. Okay, so what do we have here? So humans, by classification, if you look up a biology book, we're classified as a primate species. And so evolutionary-wise, we have a common ape ancestor. We're not like, we didn't evolve from like gorillas, but we have a common ape ancestor that occurred about 8 million years ago. And does anybody recognize that image on the upper left corner? What is that? Who's that? Lucy. Yay. Wow, you guys are so sharp in all of these things, you know. Lucy is Lucy was discovered in Ethiopia about 42 years ago, so she's one of the most complete remains that have been uncovered today. She lived about 3-point-something million years ago, so she's one of our human ancestors. And I think what I wanted to, and Lucy, after, they have done extensive tests on her because, like I said, she was so well conserved. And the fact of the matter is that we humans come from a long line of ancestors that are primarily herbivorous animals. Not 100%, and even, for example, the gorillas, they eat a lot of greens, but they eat some animal protein, but it's very small, and it's usually something along the lines of termites and insects. So our biology, our digestive system has evolved over millions of years to digest things that are primarily a herbivorous diet. And so I think when we stray away a lot from that premise, when we eat things that are not favoring our health, we have a higher risk of, like what you have seen today, in Dr. Reese's talk, a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. We have a higher risk of diabetes. It's not like there's one diet for prevention of one thing or one diet for prevention of the prostate cancer. It's more just like one diet that gives us more chance of just being healthy in general. Like when you go in nature, you don't see, for example, kangaroos eating this thing for one thing or one thing for another. And you also don't see them being obese. And you don't see them saying, for example, well, I feel hungry, but I'm not gonna eat because I don't wanna get fat. They don't. They eat the things that they're supposed to eat, and that way they nourish their bodies. And that's how we extract energy to support ourselves, because our bodies need energy. All of their cells require energy for all of their functions. And so in this topic that I'm talking about, cancer, one of the biggest researchers in this area is Dr. T. Colin Campbell. So I want to start a little bit talking about his research. He's one of the most prominent figures, I think, in nutritional biochemistry. He's from Cornell University, and he's done a lot of very comprehensive and well-known studies, both epidemiological, like looking at what countries and populations do over time and what incidence of disease they have, and he's also done a lot of animal research. And what he found is that we are so obsessed with consuming protein as a society, but it turns out that like this snippet that I took says, an elevated intake of protein accelerates and promotes carcinogenesis in diverse tissues. So this is something that everybody's obsessed with, consuming huge amounts of protein, and as long as it has protein, they'll eat whatever things, whatever bars, whatever sugary things, because they think that they have to get as much protein as they can. But it turns out that it's not something that's favorable for our health. And I do just want to mention really briefly that since I mentioned the animal studies, I generally do not support animal experimentation. I don't think that it's necessary because we have so many epidemiological studies with humans. I don't think animals are Fourier test tubes. But nevertheless, these studies have been done, and because they're relevant to the topic that I'm discussing, I wanted to just point them out to you real quickly. So what he did was he took large groups of rats, and he gave them a thing that causes liver cancer. Actually, it causes liver cancer in both humans and in rats. It's called aflatoxin. It's a substance that causes specifically a very specific kind of cancer. And then he gave the rats different amounts of animal protein. And so he found that the rats that had, the carcinogen, but were fed the lowest amount of animal protein, he said they were healthier and thriftier in appearance, and the ones that were fed a lot of protein, they were all just filled with tumors and dead after 100 weeks. So he found that the ones that were fed 22% animal protein, 90% of them had their liver, occupied by liver cancer, versus the ones that were fed only 6% protein had a much, much lower incidence of cancer, like markedly so. And I think this is relevant because we live, let me see what's going on here. We live in a society now, because we have so much impact in this world that we are already being exposed to a lot of substances that are not healthy for our body. We live in Houston. I think there's 500 chemical companies around the city. You were probably around here when the fire with the benzene, what was that, like a year ago? Yeah, less than that. And that was all over the news, and there was like a shelter in place. Everybody was told to not go out, but I think it's not exclusive to one area or to one period of time. I mean, we're just generally exposed to a lot of chemicals and a lot of things that are bad to our body. If you measure, if you take any human or any animal, pretty much anywhere in the world, you will find that we all test positive, for example, for BPA, which is a chemical that is used in the production of plastics that stimulates some hormone that is not a healthy thing, But if you go from the North Pole to the South Pole, everybody's exposed to that. So if we're being so exposed to so many carcinogens and just not healthy things, I think we should try our best to eat a diet that reduces our risk of some of these diseases, is what I want to say. And so let's take a look. So for example, specifically, the graph on top, the x-axis is the amount of carcinogen that they were given, the aflatoxin. So as you can see, the group that was fed a high amount of animal protein, in this case they used casein, which is an animal protein found, the main animal protein found in dairy. And so, the more aflatoxin they were given, the more cancer they developed, right? As would we expect it. But so interestingly, that the other groups that were exposed to similarly the same amount of carcinogen, so interestingly, they would not go up in the production of cancer. And I think that's just really interesting because, as he put it, nutrient intake during the post-dosing was more rate limiting to the formation of cancer than the actual carcinogen dose. And that's, again, I think it's relevant because of the environment we live in. After the big fire with the benzene that occurred last year, my partner Bob and I, we were in San Diego, and we were like, oh my gosh, this is so clean. I wish we could move here. We were in an island in front of San Diego. We were like, none of this benzene shelter in place. It's so clean. And we just did a little bit of research of what the environmental concerns were there. And apparently they have all these maritime naval ships that run on nuclear, that they don't know what to do with all the water. That's like a disaster over there. So it's we are exposed to it just everywhere, So we just really have to do our best to eat the diet that will best, I think, minimize our risk. And so, okay, so one thing that I did want to point out is that in those cases specifically, when they use plant protein, even high amounts of plant protein, they did not have that cancer response. So that cancer response was only, available with the animal protein, which is super interesting. So, yeah, so of course, when we eat food, it's a large amount of factors that interact with our body in different ways that can increase our risk of certain things, decrease the risk of certain things. For example, with the calories of animal foods, what I think one of the things that stimulate the risk of cancer is the fact that they contain a lot of heme iron, which is an oxidant they contain TMAO, they contain things that are not favorable to health. But one thing in particular that I was not aware of when I went into medical school, or when I was going through medical school, that I learned later on, and that makes a lot of sense to me, and I did want to bring it up, was something called IGF-1. Has anybody heard of this hormone? Jordan, you have heard about it? Of course, Dr. Rees. He'll be an expert in that as well. Yeah, so like I said, it's a lot of things that have to do with our cancer risk and disease of other diseases. When we eat plant foods, we're eating fiber, which also absorbs toxins and helps us eliminate them. We're eating antioxidants, we're eating phytonutrients. But IGF-1 is something that I think is important. And what is IGF-1? Well, IGF-1 is a hormone that's so-called insulin-like growth factor 1. Growth factor, it causes things to grow. And it's a hormone that is available in animal foods because they produce it as well. And it's a hormone that we make as well, and that stimulates the proliferation and growth of everything, right? Now, that can be a problem with one specific disease that I'm covering today, and that's cancer. Right? That can be a problem with cancer. Why? Well, because what is cancer? Does anybody have like a nutshell idea? Like, what is cancer?
The cells reproduce uncontrollably, don't stop.
Exactly. Cancer, whether it comes from the colon or the retina or the brain or the stomach, is simply a cell that got out of control and started reproducing. So it's usually not the cancer itself that is malignant or that kills it, but it spreads to the lungs and it causes problems there as a mass grows there that shouldn't. It spreads to the spine. It causes, compression of the spine. So it's basically uncontrolled growth of cells, and that's, that's what it is. And although a lot of, complex things go into the control of the ADN, of the cells, of them killing themselves, the control checks that they have. IGF-1 is something that will send a message to cells telling them, reproduce, 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 grow, 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 right? So it's a relevant thing. And now, as I pulled in this article, so IGF-1 is nutritionally regulated. So what kind of things cause us to produce more IGF-1 in our liver, in our body? Well, it is made in our liver. So when we eat a high amount of essential amino acids, that somehow sends a signal to our body, like, hey, we have all these amino acids, we have to build a lot, produce more IGF-1. And so eating a high amount of protein that is concentrated in essential amino acids is gonna favor our own production of IGF-1. And the opposite is true as well. So as it says, in particular, restriction of protein rich in essential amino acids reduces IGF-1. Now, what kind of protein is rich in essential amino acids and what kind of protein is poor in essential amino acids? Well, animal protein is rich in essential amino acids. Plant protein also contains essential amino acids, but in a lesser proportion. So in that way, it is protective against this specific mechanism, right? We need the essential amino acids. Those are amino acids that our body does not produce and that we need to get it from our food. However, plant foods has it, just in a lesser proportion. And as we mentioned, we don't want to go crazy on that because we don't want to go crazy on the essential amino acids. Like a lot of people think that we have to, if in the fitness world and in the regular world, it seems really everybody's just thinking that the more protein they get, the better, and they just can't get enough of it. And nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to our health and our risks for diseases. So this study, let's see. this study analyzed the difference in IGF-1 between vegetarians, vegans, and omnivores. And they found that vegans, they said 13% lower levels of IGF-1 when compared to vegetarians and when compared to omnivores. And that makes sense, of course, because if you're not eating meat, but you're still eating large amounts of dairy and eggs, like I was for a long time. I was a vegetarian for probably like over a decade, you know, eating large amounts of dairy, large amounts of eggs. Then you're still eating all that animal protein, and you're still going to have a higher amount of IGF-1. And 13%, well, people will say, well, 13%, that's so small. You know, why should we care about such a, you know, seemingly small amount of percentage of IGF-1? But these small changes have big impacts when it comes to the risk that it results in. So plant-based diet is associated with lower levels. Well, yes, that's what we have established that. So for example, this article published in the British Journal of Cancer analyzed the different IGF-1 concentrations in vegan men, and they found that vegan men had 9% lower IGF-1 concentrations compared to meat eaters. And again, when you say, oh, 9%, what's 9%? Well, here they helpfully remind us that they also found that people who had just 8% higher levels of IGF-1 were the ones who developed prostate cancer. So they said, you know, that 9% difference is significant to alter cancer risk significantly. So it's something that's relevant, that's concerning. And of course, I guess, you know, we mentioned prostate. I guess this one is a prostate too. So that may be one of the reasons why, like this article suggests, diets high in dairy products and meats are related to a higher risk of prostate cancer, incidence or mortality in most ecology, case control, or prospective studies. So it's not like just one isolated study. It's what like the body of evidence shows. Like it's what the body of evidence shows. And of course, this, you know, he looked at prostate, but it's not just one organ or another. Prostate in particular is sensitive, just like the breast is sensitive. Those hormone sensitive, those organs that are sensitive to hormones also tend to have a higher risk because meat and dairy contain high amounts of hormones, even if they say no hormones added, because they come from living beings that have hormones in their bodies. Even if the labels say no hormones added, well, they still contain large amounts of hormones that are produced naturally by the cows or by, you know, also in meat. You know, I think that the hormone situation is becoming clear for a lot of people when it comes to dairy, but they don't associate it as much with the chicken or the beef. You know, they don't realize, well, this is no hormones, but no, it still has a lot of hormones that the animals produce naturally. And so those organs, like testicles, like the prostate, like the uterine, like the breast, that are even more sensitive to hormones, have been significantly affected or are significantly affected. And this article I really wanted to share with you because I think it's so compelling. It's so interesting. It was done by a large group of universities and cancer research centers, including UCLA, UCSF, and the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, which is kind of like the MD Anderson of that area. You know, it's a very well-known and well-regarded cancer facility and research center. And what these people found, so what they did is, well, they had a group of people who were on a plant-based diet, and they drew their bloods, okay? And then they had another group of people who were on a regular Western diet, and they drew their bloods, okay? So now we have two pooled bloods, one of them from a plant-based group, one of them from a omnivores regular Western diet group. And what they found, they grabbed those bloods and then they poured it into petri dishes filled with cancer cells to see whose blood was greatest at fighting off the cancer cells, okay? Like a boxing challenge, you know, like to see who can be the best fighter here. And what they found, they found that the control group, so the people who were on the plant-based diet, had 8 times more strength at inhibiting the growth of cancer cells than the other group. So one inhibited by 70% and one inhibited by 9%. So, you know, what kind of blood do we want to have? One that's, you know, really being our champion and fighting the cells that need to die, or do we want just blood that just is gonna, you know, roll over and not be fighting it? And so, you know, this is another article that is mentioning how IGF-1 has been seen to cause atypical hyperplasia, which is the precursor to breast cancer, to breast carcinoma. This article, for example, in the International Journal of Cancer, was done in the collaboration with many different countries, Netherlands, UK, Denmark. And what they found in a completely different, unrelated cancer, in bladder cancer, what did they find? They found a 3% increase in the consumption of energy intake from animal protein was associated with a 15% higher risk of cancer. And on the contrary, a 2% increase in energy from plant protein was associated with a 23% lower risk of cancer. So I think it's super interesting that such small changes can have such a correspondingly, you know, large differences in the risk that results from that. Let's see what is it. So basically, just kind of like to sum this up, IGF-1 goes up as we consume protein-rich in essential amino acids, which is predominantly in animal foods. Yeah, I think we have established pretty much everything here. As I mentioned, in general, vegan proteins contain a higher fraction of non-essential amino acids and a lower proportion of the essential ones. So that is helpful in this regard. And of course, as I mentioned, this is just one of many mechanisms, you know, how food interacts with our body and increases or decreases our risk. We don't get phytonutrients, we don't get antioxidants, we don't get fiber when we're eating animal foods, which are very, very important in the fight against cancer in general. So, but you know, this is another interesting aspect. So in a nutshell, high quality protein upregulates IGF-1, and vegan protein, you know, plant protein expected to have the opposite effect. And you know, when it comes to animal protein, a lot of people are familiar and they'll say, well, you know, I don't eat red meat. Everybody knows that red meat is unhealthy. Oh. Red meat is associated with increased cancer mortality, cardiovascular, but it's not just red meat, but people are most familiar with this kind of meat. But the fact of the matter is that it's just animal protein in general, be that red meat, be that egg whites, be that fish, be that the sacred salmon, not salmon, it's just with my Hispanic accent coming out. One, I think, last article that I wanted to mention is this one. Oh, yes, because I was mentioning about how people are very familiar with the red meats. In fact, you know, for example, what does this large study in the International Journal of Cancer find? Well, they said a high intake of poultry was related to increased risk in, for example, B-cell lymphomas per 10 grams of intake. They said 22% higher risk of cancer per 10 grams of daily intake. What is 10 grams? I think that's a very small portion of chicken. I think like a regular chicken breast would probably be even substantially higher. Does anybody know like how many grams is in a regular like chicken breast? 120 grams? Really? Wow. Okay. So imagine if they're calculating a 22% increased risk per 10 grams of intake, you know, calculate that times whatever There's just.
Is that 10 grams a day, or?
Yes, that's what these researchers were alluding to. Yes. 22%, 10 grams. Yeah, so in conclusion, and we'll get into some questions in a second, vegan diets, because of multiple factors, not only IGF-1, but because of all of the other issues like fiber, like antioxidants, phytonutrients, they show a statistically significant protection of overall cancer incidence. And, cancer is not the number one cause of death. Dr. Rees covered that. The number one cause of death is cardiovascular disease. But cancer is something that is also important. And according to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is the largest organization of food and nutrition professionals in this country, a plant-based diet lowers our risk of diabetes by 62%. And I think that's pretty important as well. Again, it's not just one disease or the other disease. This image on the left that you see is of a patient in the Cleveland Clinic, or the paper was published by the Cleveland Clinic. I'm not sure if the patient was there, but a paper published by the Cleveland Clinic, a case study of a patient who had a heart attack, who was actually a physician. The patient himself was a doctor. And they treated him with only a plant-based diet. They didn't put any stents on him, and they didn't give him any cholesterol-lowering medications. It must have been a case where the occlusion was not such that he was going to die if he didn't get a stent. But still, it was blocked, and they saw that with the arteriography. And after, I think, something around 30 months on a plant-based diet or something like that, I'm not sure exactly, but I think around that time, as a repeat arteriography saw that what happened to the vessel opened up. And to my knowledge, there has been no other diet that has been able to replicate that. And so for all of these reasons, not just cancer, not just diabetes, not just cardiovascular, but for all of these reasons, I think a plant-based diet is the way to go. And I meant to change that to put back the snail, to say, be like the snail, eat what we're most best suited to eat, like the snail who eats the leaves for his shell. Anyway, that's it, you guys. Do you have any questions? I'm happy to hear them. Thank you.
I heard this discussed by some vegans at one time, and I was, kind of struck by it, but not sure if it was actually information that had been researched. And that is, the claim was that when animals are killed and they're in a stressful environment, they release a lot of hormones. And that when they do that, the meat that we're eating, if we eat meat, has been tainted by all these stress hormones or hormones in the meat, which compounds the problem of meat consumption and whatever it causes, whether it's hardening of arteries or cancer. Is there any validity to that?
I haven't done any reading of any research specifically with that, but I would say that, for example, number one, I don't see that being as when they're killed in stressful situations, because they're always killed in stressful situations. They're always kind of resisting it, so they're always going to be naturally stressed. And number two, I would say that whether that happens or not, that the amount of hormones that they naturally have is so high that it's really, really concerning. Because these are exogenous sex hormones, for example, in the case of estrogen, progesterone, that has an impact in our organs. But I guess the stress hormone that they could be alluding to is cortisol, because that's one of the hormones that we release when we're in stressful situations. Adrenaline is another stress hormone that we release, but that one is very quickly metabolized, and so. So the answer to your question is, I have not read any research specific to that, but they still have a lot of hormones. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you explain the difference between essential and non-essential amino acids and
Sure.
unpack that a little bit for commonplace
Sure.
terms?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So in our metabolism, in the biochemistry of our body, we have some amino acids that can be formed by other amino acids, okay? And most of them fall into that category. But we have a group of 10 essential amino acids. I could even name the 10 to you, but I don't think you're interested in hearing that. We have a group of 10 amino acids which are essential, which we cannot make from the other amino acids. So basically, we just need to get them in our diet. However, there is this misconception that those are present in only animal foods. And that is the really troubling and problematic misconception, because in fact, the only protein that I know that does not have all of the essential amino acids is gelatin, which is a protein that is made out of animals, okay, animals. But all of the research that I've done and the position statements by people like the FAO, they said as long as you're eating enough calories, you're getting all of the essential amino acids. Basically, I don't know any plant protein that does not have all of the essential amino acids. Now again, they'll have a lower proportion of it, which was initially perceived as, oh, problem or low quality. And that's how the meat got the nickname of the high quality protein versus the low quality. But the high quality is actually higher risk, because that's not something that we need, and that's something that's actually problematic. Does that make sense? But so that's the difference between essential and non-essential. The non-essentials are the ones that we can make from other amino acids in our metabolism. All right, any other question? Go ahead.
Thank you so much. So I went to a talk recently, and there was an MD, a nutritionist, and he was all about the paleo diet. And he was talking about how there are certain plants and vegetables that we aren't actually supposed to eat because we can't eat them raw. So he was arguing that beans, lentils, chickpeas, potatoes, even all those things, because we can't eat them raw, are actually bad for us and give us digestive problems. Do you have any research or any information about maybe distilling that or one or way?
Yeah. Well, I think that, for example, you mentioned potatoes. My understanding is that root vegetables were one of the most important sources of energy in the Paleolithic times. Yes, actually, root vegetables. And that is what allowed people to, supposedly, because yeah, I have done, people go crazy with that. Another thing that you mentioned, it's interesting to think about how also we're not well equipped at all to digest raw meat, okay? Because our pH of the stomach isn't low enough so that it could kill the bacteria in the raw form. That's why we don't eat raw meat, and if they do, there's all kinds of risks and parasites and really problematic dangers. So we're not equipped to eat raw meat. I understand the reasoning that can be done, beans have to be cooked. And with that, that's right. I guess they do have to be cooked. We can't eat them raw. That's right. But I will say that epidemiologically, we see that their high amount of fiber and the high amount of nutrients has been very favorable to us. And that's not the case with animal foods. Does that make sense? Okay. Anything else? Other question? All right. Well, we'll get you guys a break, and then we'll be ready for the Q&A in a little bit. Thank you guys so much.